The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 was more than a secret deal. It was a blueprint for colonizing the land of Israel and burying the truth of who the real Jews are. While the world was told that African Americans come from Ham, the bloodline says otherwise. We come from Shem, the true bloodline of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the bloodline of Christ. European powers divided the Middle East and rewrote history, planting lies in Christianity that erased our identity and gave our heritage to others. But here's the truth. Christ himself will restore Israel, not European empires. The land, the people, the promise, it was never theirs to claim. It's time the world, especially Europeans, recognize what their forefathers did, stole the identity of the true children of Israel. The curse is ending. The awakening has begun. We are not from Ham. We are Shem.
May 1916. This was a secret agreement between Great Britain, France, and Tsarist Russia.
So the Sykes-Picot Agreement was a secret agreement between France, Britain, and what they call Tsarist Russia. So what was the agreement?
That would have a profound impact on the history of the Middle East.
And this agreement would have a profound effect on the history of the Middle East. So if you want to understand current Middle East conflicts and why it seems like there can never be peace in the Middle East, you have to go back to some of these agreements and some of these things that took place going back to the 19th century and how they came in and started meddling with these places after obtaining dominion. Now, they're going to give the context of when this took place. This is after the Ottoman Empire was collapsed, right? Before Esau started working his magic over in the Middle East, the dominant force in the Middle East was the Ottoman Empire, right? They ruled over Turkey and the Middle East. They were the dominant force in the Middle East. After they collapsed, now Esau steps in and says, well, hold on. We all have interest in the Middle East. France, you have interest in the Middle East. Britain, you have interest in the Middle East. Russia, you have interest in the Middle East. So how do we come to some agreement where our interests don't interfere one with another? Well, we'll do what Esau always does. He'll sit in the boardroom, come up with some agreement amongst themselves of how they're going to divide things up. Here it is. The people that live in that place, or the people who are over that land, or the people who are native to the land, they're not invited to the meeting. They're not invited to the conference. They didn't agree to anything. Right? But Esau sits in his boardroom behind closed doors. He discusses how he's going to divide things up, how he's going to break things down, who's going to take what, and then they execute. And that's what happened with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But let me let the video play again. I have to stop and interfere with the video so that we prevent strikes.
Even today, in the era of the horrifying rise of ISIS, members of that group speak of reversing the effects of Sykes-Picot. But how exactly did it play out? And what impact does this agreement still have on the region today? In 1915, the once mighty Ottoman Empire was clearly in its final days. European nations, still caught right in the heart of World War I, were planning how this crumbling relic would soon be carved up.
All right, so y'all get that, right?
Ottoman Empire today. In 1915, the once mighty Ottoman Empire was clearly in its final days. European nations, still caught right in the heart of World War I, were planning how this crumbling relic would soon be carved up.
All right, so again, the Ottoman Empire was on its last leg. Now the nations of the West, including Russia, are stepping in and saying, well, hold up. How is this going to play out? Who's going to take what? Because now, based on who takes what, that now determines who has the edge over the other European imperialist empires. Okay? Russia, you can't have everything, because if Russia gets it, then now Russia becomes that one dominant force that no one can compete with. We can't let it be Britain, because if they get it, they'll be the one dominant force that none of us can compete with. And the same thing goes with France. So they got to make sure things are divided up so that, we keep, quote unquote, as they say, stability in the region.
In steps Sir Mark Sykes, a debonair British soldier turned politician, nicknamed the Mad Mullah by some of his contemporaries. For his
All right, so when you say Sykes-Picot, the Sykes of Sykes-Picot comes from this man's name.
extensive travel and love of the Ottoman world. He was summoned by then Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, who had only recently suffered a nervous breakdown from which he was still recovering. In this admittedly difficult meeting, Sykes was tasked with negotiating a deal with the only other powerful player in the region, France. His proposed strategy had won over not only Asquith, but also David Lloyd George, Arthur Balfour, and Lord Kitchener, who not only...
Okay, David Lloyd George, Arthur Balfour. Many of you hear of the Balfour Declaration. And you may ask yourself, well, how was it that Britain had the ability to promise a homeland for the Jewish people in Israel? Like, how did they get that influence in that area? Or what control did they have in the area to make such a promise? Well, that ability came from the Sykes-Picot Agreement. They were able to make a promise because, again, after the Ottoman Empire fell, part of what Britain got was the land of Israel. So now they were able to promise or make a promise to give the Jewish people a homeland in the land of Israel, or to strike up some type of agreement which would land with the Jewish people receiving parts of the land of Israel. Okay?
only wanted Britons to join the army in his famous and much imitated poster, but who also hated the Turks and wanted Britons to expand their empire into Turkish territory. Sykes' counterpart in negotiations would be Francois-Georges Picot, a Parisian lawyer and diplomat, and a specialist
this is the Picot of the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
In Syrian affairs. The two men argued on behalf of their nation's interests and eventually settled on a dividing line drawn up by Sykes himself that went from the port of Acre on the Mediterranean Sea.
Okay, so let's go back. Hold up.
The two men argued on behalf of their nation's interests and eventually settled on a...
So these two men argued over their nation's interest. No, this is what we want. No, this is what we want. Keep in mind, the Palestinians are not a part of this discussion. The Syrians are not a part of this discussion. These other Middle Eastern nations are not a part of this discussion. So there's a whole conversation taking place about some people's land that are not a part of the conversation and how their land should be pieced off and divided up amongst these three main powers: France, Russia, Great Britain. Right? So this is how Esau operates.
A dividing line drawn up by Sykes himself.
So he drew up the lines. Look at him. This is the guy that drew up the lines that would shape what we call today the Middle East. Okay? He drew the lines right here. So when we think about the ancient Middle East, even though the lands are still there, right? I don't want anyone to get bugged out and think that I'm saying something far out there. The lands are still there. The locations somewhat are still there. Okay? Or the locations are still there. But the divisions of land and what belongs to who and what comes under whose control as far as those nations in the Middle East, a lot of that was shaped in the 19th century. Okay, those are modern boundaries of what belongs where or what belongs to who, what nation, those are modern boundaries that were established through agreements like the one we're seeing here.
Their nation's interests and eventually settled on a dividing line drawn up by Sykes himself that went from the port of Acre on the Mediterranean Sea to Kirkuk, a city close to the Persian border. North of this dividing line would fall under the French sphere of influence, including...
Okay, 1 second.
Acre on the settled on a dividing line drawn up by Sykes himself that went from the port of Acre on the Mediterranean Sea to Kirkuk, a city close to the Persian border. North of this dividing line would fall under the French sphere of influence,
So north of the line fell under the French influence.
including modern-day Syria and Lebanon.
That included Syria and Lebanon. Right? So you wonder why these areas are always under conflict, going from one regime change to the next. In recent years, you had the regime change of Assad, President Assad. Why does it seem like these places, these areas can never have any level of peace? Okay? And yes, Ishmael is a wild man. The Arabs, a wild people. That's no disrespect, but that's what the Bible says. So yeah, off that alone, you're going to have some level of conflict. But you can't discount the meddling and the interference that has taken place in those regions, which have led those regions to continual conflict. And then the West comes in and says, well, we need a regime change. And you wonder, well, what business do you have over in Lebanon? What business do you have in Syria? Well, now we see. These are former colonies. These are places where Edom once had full control of. Right? And we're going to get into that later, where you start to see, in fact, I'll save that for later. I don't want to put the cart before the horse, but we're going to talk about why they seek regime changes, why they say one leader is against democracy, or one leader is he's oppressing his people. And then another leader steps in place that's backed by the West. And now all of a sudden, all the problems go away. But in reality, all the problems are the same. None of the problems went away. It's just they changed the face of the country. And the person in position, still oppressing the people, still has human rights violations, but they're Western backed, which means they're serving Western interests, which means they're allowing the West to come into that country and still pillage it for its finances and its resources. Okay, but we'll touch on that a bit later.
South of the line would be under the British sphere of influence, including Jordan and most of Iraq. Palestine, as always, would continue to be argued over. Russia was brought into the talks, and it was agreed that
Okay, so let's get that again. Let's get those divisions again.
British sphere of influence, including Jordan and most of Iraq. Palestine, which is a city close to the Persian border. North of this dividing line would fall under the French sphere of influence.
So north, again, we understand that's French. That included Syria and Lebanon. And I'm pretty sure when you go into some of these places today, you still see the French influence, right? Same thing when we went to Egypt. Even though Egypt was run down and dilapidated to a degree, you could still see elements of British rule in those areas, right? You can see how their streets were, how the curbs were painted a certain way. The street signs, just little small things where it's like, oh, those are the same type of street signs they have in the UK. Or that's the same way they deal with their curbs and the same way they deal with certain things in the UK. This was once a British colony. Same thing in Zimbabwe. You see little elements where it's like, I can see the British imprint on this land. Remember, Zimbabwe was once Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes, a Britishman, an Englishman. Okay? So I'm pretty sure if you go to Syria, I'm not sure if any of you have been to Syria or Lebanon, I'm pretty sure you still see little markings and trimmings of French rule and influence over those areas.
Including modern-day Syria and Lebanon. South of the line would be under the British sphere of influence, including Jordan and most of Iraq.
So the South went to British influence, which included what?
South of the line would be under the British sphere of influence, including Jordan and most of Iraq.
So that included Jordan, Iraq, right? You wonder why both George Bush and Tony Blair, back in 2001 up to 2003, had an interest in going into the land of Iraq to remove another once considered ally turned enemy number one, Saddam Hussein. What interest did they have over there? Well, both America as well as Britain at one point held a sphere of influence where? In Iraq. Okay? So now you start to see, based on who controlled what, you start to see the politics play out. Now you understand why certain leaders are demonized. Why are they demonized? Well, they went against the former colonizer. Okay? Or what interest do they have over there? Why are things established a certain way in these lands? Well, these are imprints of nations that were colonized by the West. France, either Spain, France, Great Britain, or America, which really is just an extension of Britain.
Palestine, as always, would continue.
Same thing with Gaddafi. How did Gaddafi become an enemy? Start asking yourself, okay, who had control of Libya? Was Libya ever a colony of the West? And what did Gaddafi do to now disrupt the relationship of Libya with the West? You start putting two and two together, you start realizing, okay, this is just another narrative that's being drummed up. And again, we'll touch on it later. I don't want to go into it too much now because we're short for time. So let me just finish out the video.
To be argued over. Russia was brought into the talks, and it was agreed that Istanbul and the surrounding waterways, along with our...
Okay, so this is Tsarist Russia. This is before, the Bolshevik Revolution. Okay, this is still
Iraq.
Tsarist Russia. I believe this is...
would continue to be argued over. Russia was...
So Israel was still argued over, right? But there was still a sphere of influence between France and Great Britain in the area. Israel was still argued as far as who would control that solely. So I believe this is Tsar Nicholas II. Okay, this is what they mean by Tsarist Russia. He's the last ruler of the Tsarist Russian Empire before the Bolshevik Revolution, before Stalin and those guys. Stalin and what's the other guy? I always forget his name. You got Joseph Stalin and some of these, you all get the point. Going on, reading on, or going back to the video.
Was brought into the talks, and it was agreed that Istanbul and the surrounding waterways, along with Armenia, would be placed under Russian control once the war was over.
So Armenia would be placed under Russian control. So Russia was at the table, making agreements as to who would take what.
And so a new map was drawn in place of the Ottoman Empire, and in so doing, most of the modern-day border...
Lenin was the one I was thinking about. I think it's Vladimir Lenin. Yes, exactly, Lenin. Okay. Marx, Vladimir.